In this video, I'm going to talk about plot and to a smaller extent about structure, as these are two different but overlapping terms. In fact, so overlapping that at times they are used interchangeably and probably mistakenly. And whilst the history of this subject matter demands an unavoidable sojourn in the deep, dark, tangled forest of literary theory, I'm hoping when we emerge into the light, I will have disentangled them, at least a little. I'll begin by looking at plot and start by saying that you'll come across a lot of different definitions of plot, some of them quite contradictory, and that to add to the confusion, structure is sometimes misused interchangeably with plot. So it's important not to get too wound up about finding the perfect definition and accept the profusion of fuzziness around the borders of the term. That said, we can probably come up with something that's fairly uncontroversial and say that the plot of your story is the sequence of events as they unfold in the presentation of your story to the reader. We could round this out slightly by saying this takes into account elements of causality. X does Y and hence Z happens. One further point for consideration, in order to avoid confusion, is that plot concerns the order of events as presented to the reader, but this may not be the same as story order. Your story has a chronological start and end point, has a history and development, but the order in which you choose to present those elements, perhaps starting at the end and flashing back, is the order of your plot. Now, when studying plot, you're likely to come across a number of theories, and we'll take a whistle-stop tour of these theories or propositions about plot by looking briefly at the following figures. And we'll start at the very beginning with the very fine Aristoteles. And here's Aristotle sitting in Aristoteles Square in Thessaloniki. Aristotle says that mythos, by which he means plot, is the most essential element in drama, and that plot consists of a beginning, a middle, and an end. That there should be causal relationships between plot elements. That events should be probable or believable. I'd use the word credible. And that plot should arouse emotions in the audience. I think it's important to say that well over 2,000 years later, these are still commonplace assumptions among writers and readers alike today. And Aristotle says some interesting things on credibility and contrivance in relation to both character and plot. In the characters too, exactly as in the structure of the incidents, the poet ought always to seek what is either necessary or probable, so that it's either necessary or probable that a person of such and such a sort say or do things of the same sort, and it is either necessary or probable that this incident happen after that one. It's obvious that the solutions of plots too should come about as a result of the plot itself, and not from a contrivance, as in the Medea. And there's Medea with her dead children, but I'll say something about the Medea later on. Let's skip a couple of thousand years and a couple of thousand miles to the novelist and playwright Gustav Freytag. His model posits 5 stages to a drama which moves from exposition and inciting incident through rising action and conflict to a climax or turning point in the story and fate of the hero. This is followed by falling action or decline in the strength of the hero before the final denouement, or if it's a tragedy, catastrophe, the death of the hero. And Freytag famously represented this plot development as a pyramid. And whilst this most properly applies to drama, it's had influence more generally in terms of story development and perhaps in particular in relation to screenwriting. The French writer Georges Polti studied classical Greek drama and asserted there were 36 dramatic situations. I won't go through them all, but they include things like crime pursued by vengeance. And whilst most of his examples come from classical drama or Shakespeare, here he cites Jack the Ripper. And you have vengeance taken for kindred on kindred, such as in Hamlet, daring enterprise, as in the Jules Verne stories, abduction, as in Helen of Troy, the enigma, such as in the Riddle of the Sphinx, and so on. Each of these he breaks down into multiple subplots or models. So rivalry of kinsmen includes malicious rivalry of a brother, malicious rivalry of two brothers, rivalry of two brothers with adultery on the part of one, rivalry of sisters, rivalry of father and son for an unmarried woman. Do you remember Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? Rivalry of father and son for a married woman, rivalry of mother and daughter, rivalry of cousins, rivalry of friends, and so on. Now, how useful this is, we might question, as it does appear in the book rather like a list of plot types that have been designed after the fact to fit the story, and the number 36 seems a rather arbitrary one in a series that could be almost infinite. Which is, I suppose, where we get to the ATU index, what was originally the Arne Thompson classification system of folk tales, which included over 2,000 categorizations. These had categories such as animal tales, fairy tales, religious tales, realistic tales, and so on, and were subdivided into multiple forms. So animal tales had a subcategory of wild animals, which had a subcategory of the clever fox or other animals, and so on. Now, the Arne Thompson classification system has been refined further in recent years by Hans-Georg Uther, the U in the ATU, or Arne Thompson Uther Index of Folk Tales. If you're interested in this area, then a key text is Vladimir Prop's Morphology of the Folk Tale, in which Prop looked into the origins of Russian fairy tales, and he broke these down into 31 types, what he called functions, with particular plot patterns, such as absentation, in which a member of a family leaves the security of the home environment. This may be the hero or some other member of the family that the hero will later need to rescue. Prop also identified 7 character types, such as hero, villain, helper, princess or prize, and so on. Prop's work undoubtedly influenced Christopher Booker, and we'll look in detail at Booker's mammoth work on plots another time. Here I'll just mention that Booker strips down all stories into 7 basic plot types, and his examples are a mixture of ancient classics and contemporary Hollywood. So you have Overcoming the Monster, which includes the Epic of Gilgamesh and James Bond. Rags to Riches, which includes Cinderella and The Lion King. The Quest, which includes The Odyssey and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Voyage and Return, which includes The Lord of the Rings and The Wizard of Oz. Comedy, which includes A Winter's Tale and 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Tragedy, which includes Macbeth and Lolita. And Rebirth, which includes Snow White and A Christmas Carol. Now, whilst I find all kinds of problems with Booker's work, it has been very influential, and it does contain much of interest. So we'll be looking at it in more detail another time. But I must also just mention that Booker was a strange man, a Daily Telegraph journalist with retrograde right-wing attitudes, a climate change denier whose work the campaigner George Monbiot describes as reckless endangerment of the public. I more kindly have dubbed him Booker the Nutter. May he rest in pieces. I'll just make mention of 1 or 2 plot devices you might come across. And we'll start with the Deus Ex Machina, or God from the Machine. Now, this was a mechanical device used in ancient Greek theatre, on which the gods would be lifted from beneath the stage, or sometimes lowered from above. And as I mentioned earlier, Aristotle criticized its use in Euripides' Medea. In this play, Medea has got herself into something of a pickle, having murdered her own children in order to take revenge on her unfaithful husband, Jason, who, on discovering this, rushes on stage to do her in. Now, in order to save Medea from her raging husband, the playwright Euripides employs the deus ex machina in the form of a dragon-drawn chariot sent by Medea's grandfather, the sun god Helios. Medea is able to taunt Jason from the safety of Helios' chariot, which then transports her to the safety of Athens. Now, Aristotle's argument is essentially that, like Medea, the writer has also got himself into a pickle and couldn't think of a credible way for Medea to escape her husband, so had a god pluck her off the stage. So employing the deus ex machina, which has become a term not for an actual piece of stage machinery, but rather for the use of an unlikely plot resolution, is generally frowned upon by critics, and writers who use it are regarded as too lazy or inept to resolve the plot in a believable manner. So unless being playful, beware of thinking up incredible, and by that I mean not credible, solutions to difficulties your characters are in. Sometimes the deus ex machina plot device is employed deliberately, for example to comic effect in a scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian, where Brian, who lives in Judea in 33 AD, is saved from a high fall by a passing alien spaceship. So we might say that the deus ex machina is employed in the form of invasion of a trope from the science fiction genre. And I'll just read Chekhov's statement that has become a key principle in storytelling. Remove everything that has no relevance to the story. If you say in the first chapter that there's a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. And this, of course, is good advice to any writer, to be economical and only include elements which have a function. But it's also related to foreshadowing, another key plot device, which is about planting an idea in the head of the reader, sometimes as little more than a vague hint, that then gives credibility to an event that happens later. The red herring is a device associated with crime fiction, most famously employed in Agatha Christie's whodunits. A red herring is simply a false clue used by writers to mislead the readers. In Christie's case, to trick the reader into thinking a particular suspect was the murderer, when in fact he or she was innocent of the crime. By dropping a series of red herrings into the plot, Christie confuses the readers about who is guilty and is therefore able to dazzle them in the denouement in which the genius detective reveals the identity of the true criminal. And I'll say something about the MacGuffin, or rather I'll let the film director, Alfred Hitchcock, who invented the term, do so.
In your films, and one of them is a MacGuffin. Can you explain what a MacGuffin is?
Yes, a MacGuffin you see in most films about spies. It is the thing that the spies are after. In the days of Rudyard Kipling, it would be the plans of the fort on the Khyber Pass. Mm-hmm. It would be the plans of an airplane engine and the plans of an atom bomb, anything you like. It's always called the thing that the characters on the screen worry about, but the audience don't care. Mm-hmm. And someone asked, what is a MacGuffin? And it's described in a scene in an English train going to Scotland, and one man says to the other opposite him, he said, what's that package above your head there? And the other man said, oh, that's a MacGuffin. He said, well, what is a MacGuffin? He said, well, it's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands Man said, but there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands. He said, then that's no MacGuffin.
Thank you for clearing that up for us.
Oh.
So a MacGuffin is an object that functions to drive the plot forward. It's an object of desire and contention that characters pursue or deem important, and hence they make choices that move the story onwards, and so the plot develops, and that's what the MacGuffin is for. So if we take the microfilm in North by Northwest, in this picture, hidden in the statue the somewhat flawed hero Roger Thornhill is holding, well, it's somehow essential to the various conflicting parties, the spies and the authorities, and pursuit of it by these parties entangles the hero in various dramatic situations, so it's key to plot. But do we as an audience care about it? Not at all. We care about the human relationships as they develop, in particular the romance between the flawed hero and heroine. And I imagine most viewers of North by Northwest, if asked about the microfilm, would answer, what microfilm? So you might go so far as to argue that every plot device in a Hitchcock thriller is a MacGuffin, because Hitchcock doesn't give a damn about them either. They're just a useful tool or plot device to drive the story forward. What he's really interested in is human nature, human violence and our psychopathic tendencies, and human relationships, in particular the sexual relationship between men and women. The communist philosopher Slavoj Žižek adapts Hitchcock's story about the MacGuffin in a manner which perhaps clarifies it a little. There are two men on a train in Scotland. One man, seeing an enormous package on the baggage rack, asks, "What's that thing up there?" "Oh, that's a MacGuffin." "What's a MacGuffin?" "Well, it's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands." "But there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands." You see, it works. And that's the function of the MacGuffin, to be meaningless but to function. Now, I'd just like to say something about linear and non-linear plots. But before I do so, I just want to mention one of my favourite film directors, Jean-Luc Godard, who, when asked if a story should have a beginning, a middle and an end, answered, yes, but not necessarily in that order. So plots are often described in terms of their shape or chronology. Traditional linear plots are ones in which there's a beginning, middle and end, and story events occur in chronological order. A happens first, B happens next, and C happens third, and so on. Non-linear plots may start in medias res, may use flashbacks and flash-forwards, may present story information non-chronologically, so the order might be B, A, C. And then there are circular plots, in which both protagonist and story somehow return to where they began, so you have an A-B-A pattern. And then there are complex modernist and postmodernist plots, in which time is fractured and situation uncertain, and nowhere is plot more self-consciously manipulated than in the dizzying spiral of Julio Cortázar's The Continuity of Parks. Now, I think of plot as the order of events as presented to the reader. So what happens first, what happens next, along with causality, why it happens, what motivates the narrative development. And whilst I'm not going to say much about structure, as I've gone on long enough already, I would say that we should think of structure as wider than plot, as a more elastic and flexible term, concerning composition elements of stories and not just the narrative development. So for illustrative purposes, we'll skip to the world of film for a moment, and a film that I think most people will be familiar with. So in The Wizard of Oz, which moves in a chronologically linear manner, its shape is nevertheless circular, moving from Kansas to Oz and back to Kansas. and its structure is composed of multiple related parallelisms and variations, musical motifs that repeat throughout the story. We're off to see the wizard! And colours that signify but differentiate. The yellow brick road, the emerald palace, the ruby slippers, along with characters that are mirrored across the different real and fantasy worlds, such as Miss Gulch in Kansas and the Wicked Witch in Oz. Or in a story such as Ruth Rendell's A Glowing Future, whilst the plot events pan out in a linear manner, the structure is built on alternating narrative points of views, male and female, with character reflections moving backwards and forwards in time, with parallelisms come ironical counterpoints in language and phraseology, and so on. All these elements are part of the structure, but I wouldn't normally think of this as plot. So, as we come to the end of this brief introduction to plot and structure, I would say that in terms of productive writing, the key thing to remember is not so much the Aristotelian mythos or props morphologies, but rather the need for your story to grab the reader's attention, keep her in your claws, ratchet up the suspense, surprise her with an unexpected twist, and don't let her out of your grasp till you've come to a fully satisfying resolution. If you do this, you probably won't need to worry too much about getting lost in the dark forest of theory. You'll be soaring over the Elysian plain.